The truth about history's most ridiculous lawsuit is completely lost because of an unbelievable cover-up. The defendants, a literal swarm of bugs sued in 1587, physically ate the judge's final verdict. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Look, we've all been exceptionally annoyed by seasonal bugs at some point, right? Maybe a rogue mosquito completely ruined your summer barbecue, or an army of ants aggressively invaded your kitchen pantry over the weekend. But what if, instead of simply buying an expensive can of bug spray, you actually went out, hired a high-powered attorney, filed a formal civil lawsuit, and took those six-legged trespassers straight to court? It sounds exactly like a ridiculous sketch comedy routine, but in the year 1587, this absurd scenario actually happened. I am incredibly hyped today to tell you all about the infamous trial of the weevils, an absolutely mind-blowing historical event where the French winemaking town of Saint Julien legally sued a literal swarm of ravenous insects. But here is the wildest part of the entire narrative. This wasn't just some elaborate practical joke to them. It was a deadly serious, legally binding, meticulously documented, months-long legal battle. Today, we're going to dive incredibly deep into a forgotten historical story that ultimately proves human beings will use complex bureaucracy to try and violently control the otherwise uncontrollable forces of nature. We're talking about brilliant defense lawyers strictly for beetles, officially designated insect pastures, and legally mandated pest evictions. Grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's explore the craziest lawsuit in human history. Let's talk extensively about the specific defendants in this bizarre case, Rheinscheide's bacchus, otherwise known as the grapevine snout beetle. According to a comprehensive 2012 European entomology report, these incredibly tiny 5mm pests can somehow destroy up to 80% of a single vineyard's total seasonal yield by systematically severing the fragile green grape stems. This makes their hyper-destructive feeding habits utterly devastating to historic local agricultural economies that completely rely on annual wine production. Now, you might be thinking that suing random animals wasn't exactly a normal thing to do, but it wasn't a spontaneous new idea either. The strict legal precedent for successfully prosecuting non-human entities was firmly established centuries prior to this event. For example, in the year 1266, a runaway pig in Fontenay-aux-Roses was actually put on trial, formally convicted of murder, and publicly executed for severely injuring a human child. Medieval justice applied strict moral responsibility to literally everything with a pulse. However, you couldn't just drag annoying bugs into a standard civil courtroom and expect a swift resolution. Under the deeply entrenched legal framework of 1588, animal property damage fell strictly under the powerful jurisdiction of the local ecclesiastical courts. Because massive swarms of flying insects couldn't physically be captured and jailed like a rogue terrestrial farm animal, they absolutely required the supreme spiritual authority of the regional bishop to face any genuine consequences. According to the justice system of the era, every single accused party fundamentally deserves fair and robust legal representation. So, the ecclesiastical court officially appointed a highly respected human defense attorney named Antoine Filiol to fiercely represent the weevils. Court financial ledgers specifically dated from April 1587 explicitly show that his legal fees were paid directly by the town's public treasury, shockingly costing the furious farmers roughly 3 months' worth of an average laborer's wages. Filiol didn't just quietly phone it in and collect his easy paycheck, he actually delivered a truly masterful, highly complex theological defense. Citing ancient religious texts dating all the way back to 400 AD, he argued brilliantly that Genesis 1:30 explicitly and undeniably gave every single green plant to all living creatures. Therefore, his hungry insect clients were simply exercising their unalienable, God-given right to consume their natural food, ultimately rendering the farmer's selfish lawsuit completely invalid. The prosecution, aggressively representing the furious and financially terrified grape growers, fired back with their own passionate counter-argument in May 1587. Their lead attorney vehemently stated that human beings were explicitly granted total dominion over the earth and all creeping things. He powerfully argued the tiny green beetles were essentially operating as malicious agents of chaos, actively subverting the divinely ordained economic order of the hard-working French peasantry. Seeking a peaceful, mutually beneficial settlement to avoid further costly litigation, the local mayor generously offered a genuinely bizarre compromise. In June 1587, The town council formally and legally deeded a specific, surveyed plot of land outside the village, limit solely to the weevils. This official insect pasture consisted of exactly 42 acres of wilderness where the destructive bugs could ostensibly live their lives in total peace away from the precious vineyards. But Attorney Filial, ever the fiercely dedicated advocate, actually completely rejected this incredibly generous settlement on behalf of his insect clients. By September 1587, he officially filed a formal legal objection to the court, clearly stating the proposed bug sanctuary was completely sterile, filled with barren rocks, and contained a working red ochre mine that made the dusty habitat completely unsuitable for long-term weevil survival and reproduction. The economic stakes for the village of Saint Julien were absolutely monumental during this time. Verified historical tax records from the 1580s indicate this single farming region reliably produced well over 200,000 liters of high-quality wine annually. A completely lost harvest wasn't just a mild inconvenience, it directly meant mass starvation, terrifying unpayable debts to ruthless feudal lords, and total economic collapse for roughly 70 local working-class families. If the stubborn bugs completely refused to relocate to their new property, the absolute ultimate weapon of the ecclesiastical court was the anathema, or formal excommunication. The powerful church had successfully utilized this spiritual nuclear option many times before. Specifically, in the year 1120, the powerful Bishop of Leon formally excommunicated an entire massive swarm of crop-eating field mice, effectively cursing them in the eyes of the church and demanding their removal. This unprecedented litigation was an absolute, mind-numbing bureaucratic nightmare for everyone involved. Endless legal stalling tactics and pedantic procedural delays caused the absurd trial to drag on for over 8 excruciatingly long months, spanning from late 1587 well into 1588. High-paid lawyers frequently requested multiple trial extensions to carefully gather expert witnesses, treating the six-legged defendants with the exact same serious gravity as elite human citizens. We truly only know these astonishing, hyper-specific historical details today because of the meticulous, borderline obsessive record-keeping of medieval court clerks. When a highly dedicated Marian historian finally scoured the dusty regional archives in 1845, they amazingly uncovered 29 detailed vellum folios dedicated exclusively to this single weevil trial. The incredibly expensive parchment used to record the events highlights just how seriously local authorities took this chaotic case. Now, this is exactly where the historical narrative gets wildly, unbelievably ironic. When esteemed legal scholar Carl von Amira published a massive, comprehensive study of these archived documents in 1888, he sorrowfully revealed that the final verdict page was totally destroyed. The crucial piece of parchment detailing the judge's ultimate ruling had been completely chewed to tiny pieces by actual hungry rats or insect pests deep in the archives. Surprisingly, the hungry weevils weren't the only unfortunate victims of bizarre interspecies jurisprudence during this strange era. Across Europe, over 200 bizarre animal trials were heavily documented by various courts. In a particularly baffling and genuinely tragic case from 1474, the major city of Basel, Switzerland, actually burned an innocent rooster at the stake after formally convicting it of the unnatural, legally defined demonic crime of successfully laying an egg. Scientifically speaking, the exact timeline of the lengthy St. Julien lawsuit perfectly aligned with the snout bug's natural hibernation cycle. According to a heavily cited 2015 agricultural science paper, these specific snout beetles naturally retreat deep into the soil during the freezing late autumn months. Therefore, to the completely unscientific medieval farmers, it genuinely appeared as though the terrible bugs were strictly obeying the human judge's court-ordered eviction notice. To make matters even more legally ridiculous, the rules of the era dictated that the insects literally had to be served their court summons. According to legal precedent established in 1532, court bailiffs were legally required to march directly into the infested vineyards, unroll a formal parchment, and read the written legal warnings aloud to the swarming bugs 3 separate times before the trial could officially commence in the courtroom. Financially speaking, this protracted litigation was an absolute, unmitigated black hole. Modern economists evaluating historical currency values against the silver standard estimate the total combined cost of the court scribes, elite lawyers, and heavy administrative fees easily exceeded $45,000 in 2024 inflation-adjusted currency. The desperate, terrified town nearly bankrupted itself completely, just legally outmaneuvering a tiny opponent with a biological brain roughly the size of a grain of salt. Furthermore, severe global environmental factors played a massive, hidden background role in generating this terrifying swarm. Modern climatologists explicitly note that the absurd trial occurred directly during the terrifying beginning of the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift spanning from roughly 1300 to 1850. Plummeting regional temperatures utterly devastated natural wild forage, rapidly forcing millions of starving forest weevils directly into the warmer, heavily cultivated valleys of vulnerable human settlements. Surprisingly, there is a genuinely fascinating modern legal parallel to this seemingly crazy medieval madness. The controversial idea of natural ecosystems having actual legal standing has incredibly returned to the modern courtroom. In 2017, the massive Wanganui River in New Zealand was officially and legally granted the exact identical legal rights of a living human being, successfully allowing designated human guardians to aggressively sue toxic corporate polluters directly on the river's behalf. Looking closely at the deeply underlying religious philosophy of the era, the medieval legal code was actually surprisingly progressive in a weird way. A famous regional decree issued previously in 1545 explicitly warned local human populations against the cruel, extrajudicial physical exterminations of common pests. The ecclesiastical courts firmly believed that even the absolute most destructive crop-eating creatures were ultimately divine creations, fundamentally deserving fundamental, robust due process of the law. When we look back at the trial of the weevils from our modern, highly scientific perspective in the year 2024, it is incredibly easy to just casually laugh at these panicked 16th century farmers. We humorously picture a stuffy, arrogant judge aggressively banging a wooden gavel and pointlessly screaming at a literal swarm of tiny green beetles. But right beneath the profound, undeniable absurdity of this weird historical footnote lies a deeply moving, genuinely fascinating underlying story about raw human resilience. These desperate villagers faced total, devastating economic ruin and guaranteed mass starvation. But instead of descending into violent, panicked chaos or simply giving up all hope, they deliberately turned to the absolute highest systems of human logic, strict order, and civilized structure they possessed, the formal law. By formally and legally suing the bugs, they bravely dragged the terrifying, chaotic unpredictability of the massive natural world directly into a structured, man-made courtroom where humans safely made the rules. It was a massive, brilliantly executed psychological illusion of control, beautifully wrapped in expensive vellum and complex theological debate. And let's be perfectly honest with ourselves. The fact that the very insects they sued ended up literally eating the final verdict page completely off the historical record is the absolute most perfect, brilliant, poetic punchline Mother Nature could have ever possibly delivered. Nature absolutely doesn't care about our imaginary property lines, our strict legal codes, or our grand courtroom speeches. It simply eats, gracefully survives, and persistently moves on. If you learned something entirely new today, or if you just really love exploring the weirder, forgotten, incredibly strange corners of our shared human history, please generously smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Let me know down in the comments below if you could personally sue any highly annoying animal today. What would you legally take to court and why? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.